Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Oprah author, Pulitzer winner, Anna Quindlen. Thank you for being here, Anna.
Thank you.
We've all read your columns for years. Do you have any idea how many columns you've written?
You know, I tried to work that out one day. I think it's around 1,000.
It's amazing.
But there were the Times columns and the Newsweek columns and so on and so forth. But I've sort of covered the waterfront in that area.
When you think back over your body of work, are there any columns that stand out to you as being pivotal in terms of your career?
Yeah, the columns that I won the Pulitzer for were partly because I happened to be in the right place at the right time. It was my second year as an op-ed page columnist at the New York Times, and Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment during his time being confirmed as a justice of the Supreme Court. I wrote 4 columns about that, and I think that it illustrates a really important point that's been much discussed in my line of work over the years. I think I brought a specific point of view to that issue and those columns because I was female. I was the only woman on the page. And I think my male colleagues just didn't apprehend the possibility of sexual harassment in the workplace in the same way that I did. So those columns really stand out for me.
What do you think have been your most controversial columns?
I wrote a column in 1988 about the fact that we were expecting our 3rd child. I was 36 years old, and I didn't intend to have amniocentesis, prenatal testing, because no matter what the condition of the baby that would be born, we intended to go ahead. Given the fact that I was known as pro-choice, as being in favor of reproductive rights for women, my usual readership went up like a rocket about that. They were really annoyed. Someone wrote in and said, the Anna Quindlen I know would never have written that column. And it was kind of an astonishing response, so astonishing that the New York Times published an entire page of letters in response to that column.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, yeah.
When you're writing about pro-choice issues, you know there's going to probably be a backlash. Have any of your columns been unexpectedly controversial?
You know, it was unexpected for me, although now I feel as though I was a bit naive. When I first started in 1990, I sort of fell into writing a column about the rights of gay men and lesbians. Didn't really think a whole lot about it, wrote it. Woo! The mail that we got would take the paint off the walls. I have committed most of Leviticus to memory at this point. But then the mail that we got was also from gay men and lesbians saying, oh my God, a straight person standing up for us in print. And I thought that was both so powerful and so sad that they thought it was worthy of notice that I had done that. The end result was I stuck with that issue all along the rest of my career as a columnist. But I was blindsided by how hot button it was. And I am so thrilled now by the fact that of all the hot button issues I've written about over my career, that's the one that's moved farthest in the public mind. I mean, if someone had said to me, looking at that mail in 1990, someday you're going to be writing about gay marriage, I would have said you're out of your mind. And here we are.
Do you ever second guess yourself as a columnist? Did you ever want to go back and write a postscript to something you'd written? You
know, I never did until the very end when I wrote a column about digital books and about reading on paper. And the brunt of the column is basically that reading on paper is better, that digital is second best. The following summer, I got my iPad, and I wound up reading 14 books during the course of the summer, and I didn't read a single one on paper. And I thought this was a column where my emphasis was incorrect because of lack of experience.
You said early on in your career that you couldn't write an honest column without involving your family. How tricky has that been for them, and how tricky for you?
Well, I stopped writing those kinds of columns in the main when my first child learned to read. And that was not accidental. I mean, I was writing about really little boys whose friends were not going to say to them, "Oh, your mom wrote a column about you today." And my husband was vetting every column. I basically gave him the columns and said, "Give me an up or a down. If you give me the down, we're not going to work around the margins. You give me a down, it's gone." Because I want to make sure my self-protection gene was in full flower. He never KO'd anything. But as they got older and older, there were fewer and fewer columns about them. And I always sent them to them first to make sure that they didn't have any objection. You just have to be really, really careful. I mean, columns come and go, but your family is forever.
Oh, exactly. In some ways, though, don't you think it will help your children get to know you better at that time of your life because you've written those columns?
Well, my children will argue that they know me so well, in fact, more than they ever wanted to know, way overshare. But the truth is that that's what Jerry said. When I published Living Out Loud, he said, the great mystery for most kids is what their parents really think about things, and your kids will know that. And that was a wonderful thing for him to say to me.
All of your fans have their favorite Anna Quindlen columns. You mentioned Living Out Loud, and my favorite column of all time appears in that book. It's Mothers. I lost my mother when I was 2. When you were a teenager, your mother died of ovarian cancer. How has that early grief shaped you as a writer? You've used that great phrase about becoming an archaeologist of the soul.
I mean, it's almost impossible for me to separate out who I am, what I do, how I feel, how I live from my mother's death. It just was so pivotal. And I think it did 2 competing things for me. One was that it made me kind of manic. There is no time to waste, therefore we must run as fast as we can. And conversely, it made me realize the glory of everyday life. And as I got older and wiser, I found myself balancing the 2, and more often opting for the second. In terms of the cliche, stopping and smelling the roses. I mean, it certainly shaped my attitude towards aging. All of my friends were, oh, I'm turning 50, and I feel like they're all bonus years, and that in some sense I'm living for 2, so I better do a darn good job of it.
Well, you have been doing a darn good job of it. You mentioned winning the Pulitzer. I think that was in 1992 when you were at the Times. And I wonder what impact that had on you, not only for your career, but personally.
I mean, it sort of settles something in an odd kind of way. You don't really have to prove anything anymore. Russell Baker, my former colleague at the New York Times, used to say, "You always know what the first line of your obituary will be," and I guess that's true.
What a relief, huh?
But I was very, very lucky because it didn't change my life very much. I already had the best job in journalism, and I was an op-ed page columnist for the New York Times. So while some people get the Pulitzer and it enables them to move to a bigger paper or a better job, that wasn't a question for me. It was more a sense of kind of having that imprimatur. You're good at this, and that's a wonderful feeling.
How did you find out you'd won?
Nominally, at that time, you got a telegram, but there's always a lot of buzz, and one of my really good friends called me at about 10 o'clock in the morning on what we call Pulitzer Day and said, "Okay, I hear you won the Pulitzer." And I said, "I'll believe it when the AP moves it." And he said, "You would believe the AP over me?" That's the kind of guy he is. And then about an hour later, the Today Show people called and asked me if I would be on in the first hour. And the president of NBC was on the Pulitzer jury. And at that point I thought, even called my dad. And then at 3 o'clock, the operator called me from, I believe it was Las Vegas, Nevada, to read me the telegram over the phone, stopped about midway through and said, "Why, this is wonderful." And I said, "Yeah, thanks very much."
In more recent years, you've been writing your column, The Last Word, for Newsweek. How hard was it for you to step aside and literally write the last word?
Not hard at all.
Really not?
No, I'm a really decisive person. I think I was probably a year and a half out from that column when I thought, time to go. And my plan was that I would write my last Newsweek column just after the election of 2008 was decided, and of course that would have been the perfect time. But the magazine was planning a redesign in May of that year, and so the editors asked me to stay on and do my last column for the last issue before the redesign. So I wound up going until May.
You've gotten so much acclaim for your nonfiction, but also for your fiction. What can you say in your fiction that you can't say straight out in your nonfiction?
It's just bigger. It's bigger, it's more nuanced, you can cover more ground. You know, I was talking to someone yesterday about the connections that we make through writing. And you do make a powerful connection through columns. I know that from talking to readers. It's a different kind of connection than when you create a world and invite someone to live in it. And ultimately, I think that can create a more powerful synthesis between reader and writer in terms of them getting into your head and learning something from you.
You've said of all your novels, Object Lessons is the most autobiographical.
Right.
How so?
Well, my mother was Italian, my father was Irish, my grandfather was a very strong and powerful figure. I grew up in the kind of suburb that's in that book. And I think that's kind of typical. If you look at the span of work of most fiction writers, usually it's the first book that's the most autobiographical. You know, there's that old saw that says you have 30 years to write your first novel and 3 years to write your second, which is why the second is often so daunting.
Absolutely. But you know, Anna, people want to read your personal narrative into One True Thing because we have the mother in the story dying of cancer. What takes that story beyond your personal experience?
Oh, the fact that none of the characters are anything like people in real life. I mean, probably of all the protagonists I've had in my books, Ellen Golden, who's the protagonist of One True Thing, is the one I like least.
Really?
And yeah, one of my challenges in the book was every once in a while I'd read over what I'd written, I'd say, "You're trying to nice her up, Anna. You're trying to nice her up so you like her more." And then I'd have to peel back from that because she's kind of a hard nut to crack, and the progression of her throughout the book is her becoming a more compassionate, a more understanding person. But in the beginning, she's kind of a heat-seeking missile. And her mom is nothing like my mom, except that she is a wife and mother without work outside the home. And the dad is nothing like my dad. I mean, it was amazing to me afterwards how people would say, "Now, what college does your father teach at?" And I'd say, "It's fiction." But you know, everyone, I'm reading a very fine biography of Jane Austen by Claire Tomalin, who has a biography of Charles Dickens, my favorite writer, coming out at the end of October. And because Tomalin has so little to work with Austen, much of what she's doing is trying to find the keys to Austen's life within her fiction. And you can find those keys, but it's a mistake to make it too literal a connection and a comparison.
What did you think of the movie version of One True Thing?
Loved it. I thought it was terrific. People say to me, "Well, you know, they changed things that were in the book." Well, yes. A movie is a different form than a novel. And if you don't want them to change your novel for the movie, then do not sell it to the movies. No one forces you to do that. But I thought the people who made it were very sensitive to my work, understood the underpinnings of it. The performances were terrific. I just was thrilled.
Were you involved with it at all?
Not really. I mean, they tried to keep me in the loop, but first of all, reimagining my own material is not my strong suit. And second of all, I sort of don't think you want the writer looking over your shoulder. I mean, these were very smart, very sensitive people who really had the ability to say, "Okay, this is the direction in which we're going to take it." And I just let them do their stuff. I took the kids and was on set one night, which was pretty exciting.
I bet.
But other than that, I kept a distance from it.
Your Oprah novel, Black and Blue. When did you decide you wanted to write a book about spousal abuse?
I actually never decided I wanted to write a book about spousal abuse. I wanted to write a book about identity in women. I wanted to write about the ways in which women often take on this carapace of loving roles. You know, you meet them and they, well, I'm so-and-so's mother, I'm
Yes.
so-and-so's daughter,
Yes.
I'm so-and-so's wife, I'm so-and-so's friend. And what it would be like for us, what it would mean to us if we had to strip away all those things. Is there anybody at home when we're not loving and caring and nurturing? And the only way I could think to illustrate that was to have a woman who had to abandon her entire life. You know, there's a great tradition of picaresque novels. People suddenly pick up and leave home. I can't imagine any woman willingly doing that. I mean, home is too precious. It's been assembled piece by piece. And so I had to think of a way in which a woman would be willing to jettison literally her entire life up until that point. And that's how I came around to the idea that maybe she was in an abusive relationship and she had to flee for her own sake and that of her son.
You were on Oprah talking about this book. What sort of feedback did you get? How did this book really resonate with women who'd been through the experience of spousal abuse?
Well, you know, it was so interesting to me because, for example, you mentioned One True Thing, and people would come up to me all the time and say, oh, I love this novel. My mother died of breast cancer when I was 16, or I nursed my mother through Alzheimer's or something. They were very, very out there about sharing their own personal experiences. But with Black and Blue, I started and I went on book tour and I'd sit there and someone would come up with the book and say, could you inscribe it to Teresa? And then she'd say, this book really meant a lot to me. And the first couple of times I said, thank you. And then I kept getting that kind of reaction and I thought, oh, we're talking in code. We can't say, this book meant a lot to me because I was in a relationship with a man who beat me or verbally abused me. It was still too shameful. It was still too humiliating. And so it was a code that I had to learn to read and respond to appropriately. Not, thank you very much, but I really appreciate that. I hope that you thought it really had a certain verisimilitude and that it worked for you. Yes, I did, you know, that kind of thing. But there were relatively few women who were willing to say, this was my life. It was as though they had to send me signals under the table.
Your most recent novel, Every Last One. I've got to tell you, Anna, it's my favorite of all your books, but it's haunting. I woke up for days after reading it and it was in my mind, it was in my psyche. What was it like for you when you were writing it, dealing with the tragedy of this scope?
It was difficult. There's no question about it. You know, there's a quote from Robert Frost in which he says, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. And certainly while I was writing this novel, I wept a lot.
I can imagine.
I mean, really a lot. But at the same time, there's this odd kind of duality that you have as a novelist, which is that every day you walk away from them. You know, Mary Beth Latham couldn't walk away from her own life in Every Last One. But every afternoon I got to save it on my hard disk and go about my business. There's something that feels like an odd kind of betrayal about that. And there's another thing about a book like this that feels like a betrayal too. You said it's your favorite. It's the book in which I felt most in control of my powers of writing. It was a book during which I kept thinking, yes, I have this. I have this. I am doing this as well as I know how to do this.
You had the control, so you could have dialed back the tragedy a little bit.
No,
you didn't.
No. That's a different kind of control. I think when you create a certain kind of character and certain situations, you lose that control because if you change or modify or dial back or give them a hand a little bit, the reader can feel that that's a lie. What I mean is the control in which you feel as though you are really firing on all cylinders. A lot of times I'm working on a novel and I think, is this any good? Oh my God, what about this chapter? This was the first time that from beginning to end I felt as though I had it. And it was a really exhilarating feeling. And consequently, and not coincidentally, it was the novel in which I had to do the least second draft work.
So you knew right from the get-go that this was going to be a full-scale tragedy.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. I knew exactly the shape of the book, and I knew that it was going to be told in the present tense because I wanted the reader to be there in real time with the characters in the book. And also the book is about what we see and what we know and what we ought to have known that we didn't. And so if it had had the kind of foreknowledge that a past tense book has, it wouldn't have made any sense. So the present tense was a big part of it. But it wasn't until I was about 60 or 70 pages into it that I got this feeling that I was really sure-handed in my task this time.
You also do edgy but heartwarming. Tell us about Blessings.
Oh, well,
Another one of my favorites.
Yeah, I really love that book. I've just thought a lot about the theme of redemption. Duh, I'm Catholic. And I also thought a lot, in part because of a wonderful neighbor that we had at our house in Pennsylvania, about using a much older woman as a protagonist in a book. I looked around and thought, that's almost never done, and yet it's such a unique opportunity because, like one of those Russian nesting dolls, you have everything in one person. You have the little girl, and you have the young woman, and you have the young mother, because of the power of memory. And so I thought a lot about Lydia Blessing and about this last opportunity she would have to redeem herself as a human being, and that's where that story developed.
And then there's the wonderful young man.
Yeah. Yeah,
Skip Charles.
He's a little bit of a tribute to my son Christopher, who is this odd kind of, rough and ready guy who also has this incredible soft center and is really a nurturing guy.
Two of your most popular books have been A Short Guide to a Happy Life and Being Perfect, which are in a way companion books. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of these books.
Well, both of those began as commencement speeches.
That you weren't allowed to give.
Well, the first one I wasn't allowed to give at Villanova. That was kind of a sad event. I actually took myself out of it because there was going to be a lot of Sturm und Drang around the question of having a pro-choice Catholic mother of three at a Catholic college, and it went out over the internet. That's I think that's a really interesting phenomenon because you can find both of these speeches online anytime you want. You can print them out you don't have to pay whatever the list cost of that book is, and yet there's something about having things in hard covers that people still really respond to. As I said, I really like my digital books, but when I have a book that I really love, when this biography of Charles Dickens lands on my desk, it's going to be a hardcover book because there's something about the books that you want to keep, the books you want to reread, the books you might want to hand on or hand down that cries out for the old familiar form.
Another book of yours that's been very popular, Good Dogs Stay. How hard was that one to write?
Actually, that one was kind of great because in a way it was a little bit of a family memorial. All of us are in that together. We've got that wonderful photograph of Bo, my deceased Labrador Retriever, on the cover, which was taken, right before we put him down. And I think the five of us really like to have that as a memory of our time with him.
Do you have a new dog?
We do. We have a black Labrador named Gus, who we got about a year after Bo died to keep B company. I always think of them as bone marrow donors. They're not really there because we want them. We want them for the other dog, and then we fall in love with them for their own selves.
You're working on two new books. First, your memoir, which is going to be out in the spring of 2012, about aging.
Right, called Lots of Candles, Plenty of Cake. It's a very optimistic look at aging, although the people who've read it at Random House seem to think it's not so much about aging as it is about coming of age. About what I've learned about the power of female friendship, about the power of the generations that have gone before us, about the need to step aside at a certain point and let the younger generation move up, about mortality, about motherhood. So that's due on May 1st of next year.
Oh, that's pretty exciting stuff. When you wrote this book, did you make any discoveries about yourself that surprised you at all?
I think it was more looking at myself whole that was really interesting. That over the years, because I've been a columnist, I've done it in this kind of scattershot way. Okay, here I am as a young mother. Okay, here I am as the long married. Okay, here I am as the wife or the friend. But I've never pulled it all together and thought about it as a continuum in that way. And that was what was really interesting, to think of the entire span of my life, from being a little girl to being a woman who will be 60 next year.
Well, and you've got a new novel in the works, and you're 60 some odd pages into it.
Yes, I am.
Can you tell us anything about it without jinxing it?
I'm trying to write a love story, because I never have before, but an odd kind of love story, a love story between two people who think that they have nothing in common, who are of quite different ages, quite different backgrounds, and it's also a book about art and what art really means, because the protagonist is a woman who's been a very famous photographer. Almost accidentally, and has been valued for work that she's not necessarily sure stands the test of time. So we'll see how it all turns out in the end.
We just have under a minute left, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the most common misconceptions about you? Here you are, this incredibly successful writer.
Oh, first of all, I think it's sort of the grand life thing. You know, every once in a while I'll be mopping something I've spilled off the floor, and one of the kids will come by and say, "Well, Mom, it's a glamorous life, but somebody's got to live it." I mean, most of the time it's all about making dinner.
Thank you so much for being here, Anna. And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.